Good evening, everyone. I'm Amy Sangiolo, Vice Chair of the Newton Democratic City Committee and Chair of the Climate Crisis Subcommittee. I'd like to welcome everyone to another of our panels about the climate crisis. Whether because of the increased incidence of extreme weather, rising or warming seas, the energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or any of 1,000 other reasons, people everywhere are recognizing that society has to change its relationship to fossil fuels. But what are the best ways of doing this? What is already being done? These are the questions we hope to address in our panels on the climate crisis. We'll provide you with the information you need to understand solutions being considered or implemented so that you can choose to get involved as a voter, as an activist, or as a consumer. Tonight, we're focusing on the fact that regardless of how much we reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the future, many climate change impacts are already here and need to be addressed. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce Newton's own Emily Norton, who will discuss whether Newton is doing enough to prepare for climate change. Emily is a city councilor representing Ward 2 and is the executive director of the Charles River Watershed Association. Welcome, Emily, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amy. And it's such a treat to be introduced by Amy, who I used to serve with on the Newton City Council, and I miss her. And I am so grateful to the Newton Democratic City Committee for this invitation, as well as Green Newton, and to all of you for making time on this beautiful spring evening. So I will jump right into it. And hopefully this works. Oh, yes, can you see? Everyone can see the screen? I'm going to assume yes until someone tells me no. So I already said what this is about. Let's jump right into it. So first, going to start out, as Amy mentioned, well, actually, I will go back a little. I'm the executive director of the Charles River Watershed Association. For folks who are not familiar with CRWA, the group was founded in 1965 by a group of residents who did not accept the conventional wisdom at the time that the Charles could not be cleaned up. And so I'll have some photos of that in a minute. But first, and if we were in person, I would make people raise their hands, but I won't do that. I'll just explain. For those of you who don't know what a watershed is, that's okay. A lot of people don't. The definition of a watershed is basically anywhere it rains, whatever body of water that raindrop ends up in is the watershed that you're in. So you can see on the map of Massachusetts here that we actually have 28 watersheds, and you can see where the Charles is. In contrast, the Mississippi River watershed comprises all or part of 31 states, so which I think is kind of interesting contrast, and about a third of our country actually lives in that watershed. So narrowing in on the Charles, it is 80 miles long. It starts, again, if we were in person, I would make people guess, but I'll just tell you, it starts in Hopkinton, just like and I know you're all saying marathon, but it's much longer than 26 miles. It's 80 miles long, which, as you can see, it's very windy and meandering. 308 square miles, 35 cities and towns. Interesting point here is that while the watershed has 35 cities and towns, the river itself only runs through 23 cities and towns. So that's a bit of foreshadowing, because decisions made in Holliston, for example, that doesn't have the river coming through it, affects the river and also affects other communities, because water does not respect municipal boundaries. The river runs north, which is a little bit unusual, and has about 1 million residents in it. Want to acknowledge, where we are. The Charles River watershed lies in the traditional lands of the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, and the Wampanoag Native people, and we recognize them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And CRWA actually does quite a bit of work with some of our Indigenous tribes. So I'm going to start with the positive. I love telling the story about the Charles River because it's inspiring and it's very positive, and it really shows what we can do. So for those who, no one was around in 1875. I'll start way back. For many people may not realize, but we are actually at the site of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Began on the Charles River in Waltham. By 1875, a government report concluded that the river was too polluted to even clean up, anywhere from Natick downstream to the harbor. There were 43 mills just from Watertown to Boston. So think of all that pollution. This is from 1955. An author named Bernard DeVoto wrote an article about Hell's Half Acre in Cambridge, and he had this line in it. The Charles River is foul and noisome, polluted by offal and industrial wastes, scummy with oil, unlikely to be mistaken for water. Paints quite a picture, right? So here's a photo of a tributary in Medway from the Medway Dye Company. This is 1965. This is a man holding his nose near the museum, current Museum of Science location because of the sewage. You can see the color doesn't look that great. This is a fish kill in Watertown. It was not that uncommon to have dye outs then. It was very actually difficult for things to survive in the river. And this is Milford's Town Dump right on the banks of our beautiful Charles River. So really different how the river, how we used to treat the river. I won't go into the whole story of the cleanup. That's a cool presentation for another time. But this big green box shows how much sewage used to go into the Charles River. This was 1988, 1.7 billion gallons. And then by 2017, it was down to 30 million gallons. And then as you can see, it went up in 2021, which is another story for another time. But anyway, the point is the cleanup of the Charles River was, people had given up on it, said it was impossible. And now we have the seaport, which has other issues, but at least, people choose to put their gleaming new commercial buildings next to the harbor. Those of you who grew up in this area, as I did, remember when the harbor reeked of sewage and you would not put anything nice next to it. You didn't want to be next to it. Oops, I skipped one. Harbor beaches. Now you don't step in sewage when you're visiting the harbor beaches. The Esplanade is this magical place. So the cleanup of the Charles has really transformed the quality of life in the whole greater Boston area. And it's because people put their minds to it. There was litigation, we spent a bit of money, but we can do extraordinary things when we put our minds to it. I think that is something important to keep in mind when we think about the challenges that we have ahead of us. So why would a watershed group be involved in climate resilience? Because a lot of the things that we need to do to clean up the river further are the same things that will protect us from the weather extremes of climate change. So first, just to define our terms, I'm sure this crowd, I don't need to do that, but just in case, when there comes to climate action, you've got two sides really. Your mitigation, which is, so if you're looking at the boat, preventing the leak in the first place. And then you've got resilience, which is bailing out the boat. So that's what we're talking about tonight, is less about what do we do to prevent fossil fuel emissions. And I know many of you are very active on that, but really we know that there's many changes that are already here and coming and going to be worse. What can we do to protect ourselves against them? So Newton did a vulnerability assessment in 2018, which is worth going back and reading. I'm going to have a little bit of summary for you here. So one of the things they called out is that we are going to see a lot more extreme heat in the future. So how many days over 90 degrees, how many days over 100 degrees? As you can see, currently is the column on the left. And then by 2080, 2099, it's going to be very different here. And it's not like it's going to change in 2079. We are going to see each year more and more heat. Another way of putting it is that generations born today, like this is the coolest summer they're ever going to see. It's going to just get hotter and hotter. This is a map from that report as well, showing not only that it's going to be hotter, but also where our heat, where the heat is worse, basically related to where we have more impervious cover. Our paved surfaces are much hotter. Who's vulnerable? Children, the elderly, those with respiratory disease or asthma, people who work outdoors, people who don't have air conditioning. Those who grew up in this area know, I'm in my 50s. When I was a kid, no homes in Newton had air conditioning. You didn't build your homes with air conditioning. Now we can't imagine building a new home or building or school without air conditioning. This literally is an article from yesterday's New York Times that I thought was timely, that because of climate change as well as La Nina, I think we're going to see a very hot next few years. The report also called out the loss of Newton's tree canopy due to development, gas leaks, the loss of street trees with disease, and those play a critical role in protecting our residents from climate change. Not only are our summers going to be hotter, we're going to see more drought. I'm sure you've noticed that we didn't have any drought really since the 1960s. And then we did in 2016, 2020, 2021, 2022. That has become the new normal. And more rain. I'll definitely be talking a lot about this. So what this graphic shows is the top left is 1901 to 2016. This is the volume of water in your top 1% of storms. So your most intense storms, the amount of water coming down in those storms. As you can see, the Midwest saw the most growth. The top right, 1958 to 2016, our part of the country saw the greatest growth in the volume of water in those intense rainstorms. The bottom two show the future. The bottom left is future emissions, future emissions with a lower emission scenario. And the bottom right is the future in a higher emission scenario, obviously much more water with the bottom right. So we really, things are going to be very different than they are even right now. So we've already seen instances of this. This is 2 years ago in Newtonville. That this was, for those who remember, this is the photo on the right shows the Gauth Pool building, and this is the SUV that was swept into Cheesecake Brook, which is usually a teeny tiny little ditch, basically, because of how it's been re-engineered. It used to be a lovely natural stream. Now it became this flood and took this car into the brook, and it actually took out that pedestrian bridge. This is from West Newton. That's Councillor Malachy on the left, Waltham Street and Border Street, extraordinary flooding. So folks, many of you may have seen this map before, but the map in the center shows where our historic wetlands and brooks and streams were before Newton was so heavily developed. And this is important because that's where the water is coming back to. So many of our streams have been bulldozed and culverted and reshaped. As you can see on the right from that report, how much wetland acreage has been reduced since 1897, most of it. And then on the left, I just like to call this out. This is from a book called Reflections in Bellows Pond that I highly recommend. But the author made the point, she wrote it when she lived on Bellows Pond. That's why I read it. She called out a lot of the names of the communities in Massachusetts. And if you look at them, what do they all have in common? This list on the left, they all have water in them. So everything I'm talking about tonight is not just about Newton. It's really all of Massachusetts. We were very watery naturally before European colonizers came and really changed it. And it's wonderful that we have modern lives, buildings and roads and sidewalks and so forth, but it's come at a cost. And now that's coming to bite us. So this, if you remember one thing from tonight, this is really the central insight to keep in mind. On the left, we have nature. What happens with water and precipitation in a natural cover? Most, or a good half at least, of the precipitation is infiltrated into the ground, goes into your aquifer, your groundwater, ends up in the river. And the soil actually cleans the water on its way to the groundwater. Only about 10% becomes runoff and stays on the surface of the land, and the rest goes back into the atmosphere. On the right, with a heavily built up environment, such as much of Newton, very little, because it's covered by asphalt, very little of the precipitation ends up in the ground. So you end up, that's where you have your water quality problems. That's what CRWA works on, getting a cleaner river. And that's also where you increase your risk of flooding. You look at that, 55% of that precipitation becomes runoff. And as the volume of water grows, our stormwater system, we have this incredible network of stormwater pipes under the ground that we never think about, was built for a certain size of storms, not for the size of what's coming. So this is really what's really causing a lot of risk to us now. Stormwater runoff carries all kinds of, we don't really think about it much, but basically rain hits that paved surface, goes into the storm drain. Whatever is on that paved surface goes with it. No treatment, goes straight into the river. So gasoline, oil, fertilizer, pet waste, etc. So it leads to all kinds of water quality problems, which I'm not focusing on tonight, but it also increases the risk of flooding. So this graph just shows with each level of impervious cover, 55% with urban environment, less than 1% in a forested environment, the amount of rainfall that turns into runoff. Obviously, with a very urbanized area, you've got more runoff and it takes longer to infiltrate into the ground. And if you remember, I don't remember if it was last year or the year before, stories of people in New York City drowning in their basement apartments, literally because the water came up so quickly, they didn't even have time to escape. That's what we're talking about. That's the real change. What this graph shows is the amount of impervious cover in each community in the Charles River watershed. So you can see where Newton is over here, relatively urban compared to many of the communities in our watershed. Sherburne, if you've been there, there's a lot of trees, not much else. And then Somerville, barely can find a tree, very, very covered by asphalt. And this matters for us because decisions made upstream from us, particularly related to development and asphalt and impervious cover, affect us downstream because the water does not stay in that community. This is a map of, we talked about watersheds. This is a map of our sub-watersheds. So again, the same concept, water that falls in the Cheesecake Brook sub-watershed ends up in the Cheesecake Brook, whether it's underground or daylighted, and then eventually in the Charles River. The insight here is that if we want to control flooding in a certain area of the sub-watershed, for example, that area near Gath Pool, we need to be looking upstream from that water, from that sub-watershed. What can we be doing to hold in water there? And this is a map. These are all on the city's website, by the way. This is a map of our underground drainage system, our stormwater system, which I just think is fascinating. It's basically like we have a whole city underground just to convey water. So what do we do about that? Like I said, it's not about not having a built environment. It's about treating our built environment differently. Nature-based solutions. You may have heard that term before. I think of it as bringing nature back into our built environment, replicating nature, replicating natural processes. So having not just planting more trees, but you see the way this photo, the way that tree box is designed on the left, the water actually is directed into that area, into that submerged area, so that that soil is probably specially designed soil that holds water in. You've got natural plantings, again, to hold water in, rather than just a tree on a berm, because actually a regular tree on a regular sidewalk berm actually doesn't, a lot of that water will still run off into the street. On the right, same thing, that those curbs are designed to direct the stormwater in. It's you know, it's not a huge change for our lives. It's just, you know, we still have sidewalks, still have roads, but we have more nature and natural systems built into them. This is a local example. If you've ever driven by the Ascend marijuana dispensary in West Newton and wondered, like, what is going on in that parking lot? Well, thanks to Councillor Kelly, who I worked with, she represents Ward 3, we required with the Ascend special permit that they hold all of their stormwater, except in a massive, massive storm, that they have to hold 100% of their stormwater on site. So this is a designed system to direct stormwater into this natural basin with natural plantings and special soil and so forth. And it's on Ascend to also to maintain it, because periodically you need to replant and dig out some of the stuff that gets collected. So what are some other things that were in that climate resilience report that I referenced? We did update our stormwater bylaw recently. We do have new stormwater requirements and large new developments. We added the words climate change to our open space plan. These are all good things. A couple other things that they recommended we have not gotten to. So one thing that they noticed, that they called out, was that many areas of the city that are not FEMA flood zones actually do see flooding. And so we should be thinking about regulations there, such as buildings in FEMA flood zones must comply with building code requirements that preclude basements. Well, there are actually areas that flood now that aren't in FEMA flood zones, and we're not actually requiring anything there. So that was something that was called out that I'm pretty sure has not been acted on 5 years later. Another example they gave was historic or landfills. So the Rumford landfill, they said this is, and the report was done by MAPC, Massachusetts Metropolitan Area Planning Council. that they did not look at our closed Rumford Avenue landfill, but they noted as it's adjacent to mapped wetlands on the Charles River, the city may want to review whether there are any current or future concerns. So 5 years later, we have not done that. I'm going to call out that point I just made a little bit more. You might have seen a report last week. MAPC looked at historic flood claims from March 2010 was the last massive flood we had in the area, including in Newton. And what they found was that 96% of the flood claims, meaning homeowners put in, to their insurance for floods, flood damage, were not in FEMA identified flood zones. So at the risk of repeating myself, we think that FEMA flood maps are protecting us from flooding. They are not. When the last major flooding storm we had, 96% of the claims were not in those zones. But the vast majority of Newton's development decisions, and it's, again, not just Newton, Boston, Wellesley, everybody, the vast majority of our development decisions are made based on FEMA flood maps, which are no longer applicable. They have not been updated in decades. They do not take current precipitation data into account. So I'm going to jump a little bit to trees because you may know that this is something that the City Council is actively working on. I've been working, especially with Julia Maliki, on this. We have lost over half of our street tree canopy in the last 50 years. The remaining ones are not in great condition. We don't really track trees on private property, but loss of tree canopy anywhere is more heat, more flooding because trees hold in stormwater, less carbon sequestration. So doing more to protect our trees is a clear climate resilience strategy. This is a map showing tree cover, and we have a clear inequity in which parts of the city have more tree coverage. This is from a cool treeequityscore.org, and you can go visit it yourself. But basically 100% is good. That's where Waban has 100% tree coverage, and Nonantum has 53, which is way less good. So that is something that I think, should have an active plan to address. And this is just some photos to give you the example, Nonantum versus Waban. Imagine 92 Dalby Street on the hottest 90, 95, 100 degree days in the summer versus that street in Waban. Who's going to be more comfortable? Whose air is going to be cleaner? This is another example of Chestnut Hill versus West Newton. And again, which community would you, which neighborhood would you want to be in on that hot day in the end of July? Trees, I probably need to spend a ton of time persuading all of you on this, but trees cool the air, trees absorb stormwater, improve water quality, because again, they hold it in, send it into the ground, and they provide habitat for wildlife. So they provide all kinds of benefits, and that is one clear area where Newton could be doing more. I'm going to jump now to a different topic, which is dams. The Charles River in the whole watershed still has dozens of dams on the main stem, as well as the tributaries. There are several in Newton as well. Just a very short, again, I like to talk about the health of the river as well. Dams are bad for rivers. They're bad for fish that can't make them over. Even when there's fish ladders, many species can't use them. They exhaust the fish who can. They trap sediment behind the dam. They heat the water up. And they increase risk because many of them are not maintained. And so if you have a dam that goes out in a storm, that's when you have massive flooding. You don't want to have that happen. So for climate resilience reasons, for ecological reasons, it's best to remove the dams that are no longer functional, which the vast majority of ours are. So this is a list of some of the DCR-owned dams in Newton and in our surrounding area. As you can see, this is a rating from 2009. But this is, I believe, the most updated one that we have because we actually got this somewhat recently. And you can see many of them are listed as significant hazard, but fair condition, poor condition. This is really a type of infrastructure that is mostly ignored. Here's a map of where they are located. And again, if any of these were to go out suddenly, it's not good news for those who are downstream of them. This is a report that was obtained from DCR with a public records request by a CRWA staff person. And this is the Newton Lower Falls Dam. and it was found to be in poor condition. And I was like, wow, that seems like something that we should know about. So I reached out to the city engineer for Newton, Lou Taverna. And I was like, Lou, what are we doing about this? And he was like, this is the first I've heard of it. So this is not unusual that DCR, so this is the Department of Conservation and Recreation, owns dams in multiple communities, including Newton. They rate them, they, inspect them periodically. They are under no obligation to tell the community when they have found a dam in their community, but on their land, on DCR property, to be in poor condition. And there's no, as far as I know, this is, 2 years ago, nothing's been done to upgrade it. So this is a clear example of how Newton is vulnerable, and Newton can be taking more steps, even if it's to, work on pressuring DCR to fix or remove their dams. This is just one example of one that CRWA is actively working to remove. This is the DCR dam in Watertown. This one does not put Newton at risk per se, but just to give you an example of this, is the photo on the left is what it looks like now. The rendering on the right is how it could look, because that's often what people worry about. A lot of our dams, or I think arguably people find them aesthetically pleasing. You can still, it can still be very beautiful even without the dam. Even it can be a big change. So anyway, we could talk more about that if folks wanted to. And now I'm going to jump really, even more headfirst into flooding. So as I mentioned, development decisions are still being made based on FEMA flood maps that are woefully outdated. And when we do have big storms, we see that. So CRWA partnered with 20 of the watershed communities, including Newton, to build a flood model for the Charles River watershed. Basically, it's a computer simulation using updated climate data of under what circumstances flooding is likely to occur and where. And we modeled 3 different storms, a 2-year, 10-year, or 100-year storm in 3 different timeframes: current, mid-century, so 2030 to 2050, and later in the century, 2070. And you can go to play with it yourself. You can put in your own address. You can put in the address of things that matter to you. This is the kind of information that gets spit out, and you can zoom in closer. And this key on the right shows basically the darker the blue, the more water, the bigger depth of water. And just one example, oops, I put this slide in the wrong order, but I'll jump to it anyway. So people are probably aware of the MBTA, no, this is the right order. The MBTA Communities Act, which is requiring Newton and other communities that have public transit, such as the T or the commuter rail, to zone for more by right development. So the guidance for that law says, among other things, there's a whole mess of things, but among the things it says is, for example, an MBTA community may want to avoid including in a multifamily zoning district areas that are subject to flooding. May want to avoid, not shall. So I bring this example to show that it's not just Newton that is making development decisions based, really not taking flooding seriously. This is current guidance. The law, Newton hasn't even passed it. These communities are still relying on this guidance that's like, yeah, community, you might want to tell people they can, they shouldn't build where an area that's likely to flood. I don't think we're doing anyone any favors if we develop a home or a business or whatever in an area that we know is likely to flood in the future. So to me, this is an example of sort of the disconnect between our laws and our policies and what the science says is coming. All right, so those of you who get my newsletter know that I'm obsessed with this issue, but this is what the flood model shows for the Countryside School that we have just approved in the override to rebuild in its current location. So this is from the flood model. You go in and play with it yourself. Here's the site of the Countryside School on the south side of Newton, and this is under a present day 100-year storm. So a storm that has a 1% chance of occurring in the course of a year. That blue is water. And under this other blue is homes. So this area is going to see flooding, and I don't represent this area. It's Ward 8. So I haven't spoken to any of the residents there. My guess is that they probably have sump pumps already. The graphic on the right is what the flood model shows for 100-year storm in 2070. as you can see, a lot more water. And since we're building our schools to last for 50 to 100 years, this is why I did not think that it was a good idea to rebuild the school in this area. As much as I understand how complicated it is to find sites for schools, to me, I look at this and I think, that doesn't look like the natural place to put a school anymore. And this is the kind of decisions that we're going to have to be thinking about more and more. As that MAPC report showed, 96% of flood claims were not in FEMA flood zones. So, and it's not like we don't know that the Countryside School faces flooding. This was, these are some quotes from the Boston Globe from some of our staff and a school committee member talking about the flooding and why the school needs to be rebuilt. So back to the flood model, we also modeled not just where the flooding would be, but various solutions. So what if we covered the watershed with this amount of green stormwater infrastructure? What if we reduced impervious cover, like literally depaving where possible? What if we conserved land? Because not only do you want to, change how your built environment is, but areas that are not built up already, some of them you want to keep from getting built up. So that we can be using that area, continue to use that area as flood storage. And it found that these steps would help, but none of them individually. Like we really need to be doing everything. And even then, even with all of the solutions that we modeled, we still saw more flooding in the future than we see now, but at least we can keep it from being catastrophic. So just some more Newton examples. Folks may know we are doing a bunch of work at Albemarle Field. One of the solutions modeled was to, as part of that, build a massive underground storage tank for stormwater underneath the Albemarle Field. So this is something that was actually just done in Milford at the town park. It still looks like a beautiful field. You can't see it, but it now is holding in stormwater. So that is something that, and there's going to be a separate presentation on that June 8th, I think. So I'll be sending that around so people can learn more about that. This is Cheesecake Brook. The photo on the left shows what it looks like now when it doesn't have a massive flood in it like it did in that first slide. This is not how nature made the Cheesecake Brook. It has been heavily engineered. It's armored on the side. It's straight shot. It really is not that attractive. It looks like a ditch. So there could be flood mitigation benefits and ecological and habitat benefits if we were to restore some of the sinuosity, do some green stormwater infrastructure. This rendering on the right shows what some of that could look like when we did a presentation for some of the area residents. This was February 2020. I remember that for obvious reasons. Actually, some of the residents said, well, why couldn't we depave the area in between the brook and the Pheasant School? Wouldn't that be even better? And it was like, yeah, that would be. So that would be a big change, but that is a possibility for flood mitigation as well. And then this one, so I talked about flooding in the sub watershed. So if you want to deal with flooding near Albemarle, you need to look upstream in the Cheesecake Brook sub watershed. We are currently doing a master plan for McGrath Field behind the old Warren School in West Newton. And so the photo on the left shows we had a site visit with a CRWA staff person and Louise from the city. Cheesecake Brook actually goes underneath that field, and it comes out, it's daylighted in the back here. And this is not to be negative about anyone from the city, but we were doing a master plan for this field without talking about flooding, without talking about, hey, while we're doing that, why don't we do some stormwater improvements here to help with flooding downstream? And it just turned out that one department wasn't really talking to the other. And it's going to sound like a criticism. It's not a criticism. This is not historically how we haven't had to worry about these things. So this is a clear opportunity that I hope we will be pursuing, and I'm certainly advocating for that. But that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing differently, is thinking about our sub-watersheds, thinking about the whole sub-watershed to address localized flooding. Another opportunity is in the Newton Cemetery. Cold Spring Brook is undergrounded there. We could daylight it, and that would help with the flooding that Cummings Road near the Newton City Hall and the Newton Library currently experience. No one has been talking about this because, again, it's just, people don't think this way. Once we've undergrounded these things, it's like they're gone forever. This is an example of a development that is proposed for Craft Street in Newtonville, near the Whole Foods. The yellow line, so the rendering shows the proposed development. This is the company is Boylston Properties that did the Arsenal Mall project. The yellow shows where there is currently a pretty massive box culvert. No one asked them. No one from the city said, hey, as long as you're going to do this project, let's look at some flood mitigation. Let's look at maybe you could build in a daylighted stream as part of this project. It'd be beautiful, bring some nature back to this area on the north side, as well as help with flooding in the future. But this isn't something that really anyone was talking about. We invest a lot. It's not like we don't know as a city to invest in public health and public safety. So the budget that we are currently in the process of reviewing and about to vote on recommends $26 million for the Newton Police Department, which is awesome. $29 million for the Newton Fire Department. Awesome, because we understand those threats. We know that we need to invest in them. How much are we investing in someone to look at our land use and development rules and apply updated climate-informed precipitation models to identify vulnerable areas and incorporate green stormwater infrastructure into our road, sidewalk, building projects, and to look at our heat maps and our green space maps and impervious cover and air pollution and come up with a plan to protect people? We're not spending a dime on that. No one in the city is that their job. And this is not a criticism of Newton, because Boston doesn't have anyone doing that. Wellesley doesn't, Waltham, Cambridge. There's no one who has someone well, Cambridge might because they're very special, but the vast majority of us, no one has someone as their job. There's pieces here and there. The Concom looks at things related to the State Wetlands Act, and DPW, fixes things and so forth. But no one is doing, sort of taking that holistic approach to consider climate change and how do we build differently? How do we, plant trees differently and so forth, and really consider protecting people's health and safety. So I'll just end with this cool, I think really cool lesson from the past. Again, if we were in person, I'd make people raise their hands. But if anyone remembers Hurricane Connie or Diane in the 1950s, these were devastating for the entire eastern seaboard. And so this photo is from the Newton Police Department in a rowboat. It was, and the Charles River watershed was devastated as well. So the Army Corps came in and they were going to do another dam on the Charles and a bunch of levees and spend $100 million. And instead, the CRWA executive director at the time, Rita Barron, took an Army colonel on a boat ride to the upper reaches of the Charles River and showed him all of this nature that was there acting as a sponge. What they did instead was they spent $8 million buying up land, over 8,000 acres, not contiguous. And if you drive around Millis, Medfield, et cetera, you might see signs that say Charles River Natural Valley Storage Area, and you will have no idea what they mean. What it means is that these areas that are protected and just look like beautiful nature have been keeping Newton safer ever since from water rushing down the river and causing flooding here. But we don't even know about it. If Wellesley wanted to pave over a bunch of land, Millis wanted to, and they're going to make $100,000 in property tax revenues, well, maybe it's worth Cambridge, Waltham, and Newton giving them $200,000 not to do it. But there's no one whose job it is to be worried about that right now. Newton doesn't have regional government, or excuse me, Massachusetts doesn't even have regional government, even if we wanted to do that. So I guess the theme here is that there are things we can do if we use science and apply it, but our laws and our policies have not caught up. And what makes laws and policies change? Engaged residents who reach out to their elected officials and say, hey, flooding's coming, heat's coming. What are you doing to protect me? And that's why I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to share this, to share some of these insights with you. That was my last slide. I'll just leave you with this. This is a Harvard professor archaeologist who wrote, When we excavate the remains of past civilizations, we very rarely find any evidence that they as a whole society made any attempts to change in the face of a drying climate, a warming atmosphere, or other changes. I view this inflexibility as the real reason for collapse. So, not to sound depressing, I think there's actually, there's a message there that, okay, let's not be inflexible. Let's take the science, change accordingly, and then maybe we'll have a shot at actually coming up with or ending up with this inspirational story as the cleanup of the Charles. That's all I got. Thank you. And I'm happy to, I don't know, haven't been in with Amy. You tell me, I don't know if you moderate or what, but I'm happy to take questions or comments or criticism.
I think Gary's going to moderate. Gary?
Okay.
Sure. If people want to enter their questions into the chat, and I think Emily can take them straight from there.
Okay. Right. Please.
Emily, I have a question, which is, you were talking about impervious coverage, and I'm wondering if there's been any kind of analysis of how much we could reduce impervious coverage in Newton. Like what would that program look like?
Yeah, I don't know that there has been anything like that. So again, this gets, I know it gets very complicated and nerdy. And so at the risk of adding another sort of complication, Newton does have a mandate, thanks to the Clean Water Act, to reduce the amount of phosphorus pollution that we are generating for the Charles River, which causes growth of invasive species and cyanobacteria and all kinds of unhealthy stuff. As part of that, Newton has hired a consultant, Woodard and Curran, to look at what sort of green stormwater infrastructure projects we could invest in to reduce our phosphorus pollution. Again, directing water into the ground rather than into the storm drains is the insight there. I did ask at a city council meeting recently if we are, as the consultant is looking at the phosphorus reduction opportunities, if they're also generating what the flood mitigation benefits would be. And they're not. I was told that would be a change in scope of the contract, which I urged us to do. So that would be vital information to have. I do know that giving our city, the mayor and our administration a shout out, they did apply for an MVP. This is a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant. This is a state program, climate resilience program, to do what's called an H&H study, hydraulics, and I can't remember what, hydrology study that would look at sort of our land use, our topography and sort of our land layout for flooding. So basically trying to get around that issue of having FEMA flood maps that are completely useless. And so hopefully we'll get that grant, and that could generate, so it wouldn't exactly be, an impervious cover study, but it would get at that. I think it would get at this, like, all right, here's where the flooding risks are, sort of a deeper dive than the Charles River watershed flood model.
Okay, thanks. So there was a question in the chat. This is a hard question to get the public aware of, I guess, this issue overall, and as you've so ably pointed out, it's very complex in a way. And so what kind of outreach or, how can citizens get involved in getting this message out, or help influence the municipal policies in this area?
Yeah, so the way I think of it is that sort of 20 years ago, your average climate activist would be like, I think we need more solar. And now your average climate activist knows we need retail net metering of solar, we need municipal aggregation, we need building codes, we need, even people who weren't trained in it can really nerd out on energy sort of mitigation side. Now what we need is on this water and heat and so forth side, the people who are willing to march, what do we want? Stormwater bylaw. When do we want it? Now. Like we need that grassroots army to be urging a different approach to our built environment. And so even just your local officials, your state officials, hey, we know that heat is coming. It's in the news every day. We know flooding is coming. What are you doing to keep me safe? And if they don't know, then that's the opportunity to help them and say, hey, there's some resources from Charles River Watershed Association or others. And so I think even getting that conversation, because I can speak as an elected myself, if people don't ask you these things, and you don't already have the knowledge or the interest, then you're less likely to work on it. And I can tell you, before I took the job at CRWA, when I was the Massachusetts director for the Sierra Club, I didn't work on any of this stuff. I didn't understand any of this. And I kind of care a lot about the environment. So you're right. We do have an ignorance issue and we need to bring people up to speed, but we've done it on mitigation. We can do it on resilience.
Do you see much of an evolution going on in city governments, town governments in the watershed? People employed in the cities and towns proactively beginning to embrace these issues that are coming to the fore with climate change in general?
So a lot of the people who work for the cities or towns, like your sustainability directors and so forth, they do have a better sense of this. But if they don't have support from their select board and city council, then it's hard, no one's pressuring you to do it. No one wants you to do it necessarily. A lot of these things cost money. Then it's going to be really hard to make progress. It really does come down to our residents and the citizenry and the voters. Like when they want something and they advocate for it, that's when you see people. In fact, CRWA has something called the Charles River Climate Compact, which is where we bring municipal staff together. And they just went through a whole strategic plan. And that was one of the things that came out, the municipal staff saying what they needed. They need their local elected officials to be more knowledgeable, and they need the public to be more knowledgeable so that they have the support to do these projects. I mean, if you're gonna rebuild a sidewalk and you want to put in a rain garden or a bioswale, and it's going to cost a little bit more, and no one understands why you'd want to do it, then you're not gonna be able to do it.
Sure.
I mean, what we did at West Newton Square, what we did in Newtonville, it looks great. We didn't do anywhere near the amount of green stormwater infrastructure we could have. And that's a lost opportunity. Those are multi-million-dollar projects that we, didn't do as well as we could have. So it really does come down to people urging their leaders to do these things. And you don't have to be an expert. Even if you're like, you know what, I don't even understand this 1,000,000% myself, but I know that we need to be doing more. And I'd love to put you in touch with some people who can bring you up to speed.
So another question from the chat. Newton has a lot of land that can absorb water. How does one do the planning for a city like Boston that has much more impervious coverage, or maybe Somerville for that matter, more up your line?
Yeah, it's really challenging. You got to look for the opportunities where you have them. I can't speak to what Somerville is doing. Boston also has the issue that about 1/6 of it is on fill, and they've got sea level rise in addition. It's pretty clear to me that at some point people are going to have to move away from certain parts of Boston. They are doing some things like like Moakley Park. They're planning for it to be floodable. They've got things like that. But another project that CRWA is working on, there's a part of Boston called Widett Circle. It used to be open water. It's South Bay Shopping Center, really was a bay. And the T wants to put a rail yard there. And it's already one of the most low-lying parts of Boston. If you get your car towed in Boston, that's where your car ends up. So in January 2018, during those storms, anyone who had their car towed, it got flooded out. So we've been recommending that they restore it as a wetland so it could be used as flood storage, not just for that area, but for, 1,000 so acres around. And there's a lot of low-income neighborhoods in the area. And so far that's falling on deaf ears. So because land is very precious, and Boston, just like everywhere, relies on property tax revenues. Miami, there's a fascinating book I recommend, The Water Will Come by Jeff Goodell. And he talks about how Miami is incredibly vulnerable. They know it, but they are still building. They have seawater coming up through their stormwater grates, and they're still building because they need the property tax revenues so badly. So this is a really, really complicated problem.
Sure. I guess in reference to that Albemarle Field plan to potentially put those reservoirs in underneath, can the underground reservoirs be used for watering vegetation in dry times or for thermal storage?
Probably not, but I don't want to. Yeah, I'd have to get back to you on that.
You seem to be more along the lines of a artificial aquifer more than anything else.
Yeah, it's really storage. It's storage so that you don't have flooding. So the storing isn't happening in the streets, so that it can be stored there and then more slowly seep into the ground. So I don't know that it could be directed for irrigation, because I don't think you'd want to hold on to it for a long time. But
What do you
back
think of Newton's stormwater ordinance and how could it be better?
yeah, I mean, it is definitely better. There's no enforcement provision right now. So that is something that a few of us have docketed, is like, well, how are we going to make sure this happens? Because some of these systems that we're requiring developments to install, they can be clogged up. They take maintenance, and that's something, not just Newton, but even some of us personally or whatever, like maintenance is not sexy. So if they're not maintained properly, then they're going to stop working, and then you're going to have the water quality issues and you're going to have the flooding. So I think it's great as far as it goes, but we need to get that enforcement provision in and make sure we're taking it seriously. But a lot of, I do worry. I mean, the Countryside School is just one example. There's a project, well, I don't want to, I won't name it, but near Cheesecake Brook, we just approved a teeny tiny little house going down, big house, much more impervious cover, taking down trees, like right next to Cheesecake Brook. I don't really see how that is consistent with, more flood storage near brooks. That example I gave from that 2018 report that we should be not allowing basements in areas that are flood zones. Well, we haven't acted on that. That means every new project that's taking up more, that's more impervious cover, more basement, it's crowding out more water, is making the problem worse. So I do, and I've spoken with the mayor about that, and she definitely is interested. It was probably a couple months ago, so somewhat recently, but having someone on staff whose job it is to focus on this. And like I said, no one does. So it's not just us, but that would really make a difference, I think.
Yeah. Ted is asking, back in the 60s when Newton South was built, the city decided that it could not develop the land near the junior high and high school because of the floodplain. However, somewhere around the 80s to 90s, it changed and developed it. Why?
Yeah, it's in that. I highly recommend reading that MAPC report, and I could send out the link or you could find it. The 80s was a time of developing a lot of areas that we knew that had not been developed previously for a reason. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of development pressure. And we're in that now. And that's why I'm so concerned about this MBTA Communities Act. And it's not about not developing. It's just developing in areas that we know aren't going to flood. So Ted is right. Decisions were made, mistakes were made, arguably.
Okay, thanks. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I'm just going to do one thing. I'm going to put a link in the chat, which is the link to our YouTube channel for these talks, and Emily's talk will be appearing there soon. And you can go back and watch some of the other talks that we've done about the climate crisis over the course of the last year. So Emily, thanks very much. Actually, Amy, are you still online?
I am still online, but I see two hands up.
Yeah, Raina and Mike, I see have their hands up.
Raina, if you want to, oh, I see. So Mike, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Hey there, thank you. And Emily, thanks for this talk. Just to sort of amplify what you said, I think we're not thinking smaller and bigger than this. I mean, after the vehicle went into the Cheesecake Brook, we didn't put up a sign that says, "Don't drive on this road when flooded." So, that could save someone's life in the night. And we know this happens. Similarly, we know that the projection is the possibility that Boston and Cambridge could be flooded by a Sandy-like storm. And there could be refugees camping on our golf courses. I mean, that's not something we want to think about, but someone should be thinking about it.
Right.
In the horrible case when it happens. And so to me, given, just as you pointed out, this is a whole water system. It's a river system for the Charles, and broader than that. We have to work together. I wonder whether it really has to at some point be federal money or a big state grant that gets split up, because if Boston doesn't do it, or Boston does do it and Newton doesn't do it, we just get a patchwork of solutions, and no one's going to, we're going to be, maybe a few voices in the wilderness, if that. And so, I'm hoping, and maybe that this gets to my question, is there any sense that at the federal level there will be grants to deal with this? I mean, there are plenty of
There's
places.
actually
like
a
you said,
ton of
in-
money. Yeah, there's a ton of money available. But we're not going to apply it if we don't understand what the problems are. We don't even have anyone on staff who's,
Right.
This is their job. $60 million on police and fire and nothing on this. And I'm not saying take it away from that. I'm
Right.
just saying we need to recognize what would we do with money? We don't even have a plan. We don't know what we would do.
So if
we need to sort of start with recognizing we have a problem and then lay out a path to address it.
is it just in that final follow-up, is it possible that paying a person to grant fund and build our sort of understanding and expertise could pay for itself, it sounds like?
Oh, absolutely. And I've spoken with Cindy Cream about this, Senator Cream. She actually wrote a bill that I love based on the Green Communities Act, which, if folks are familiar, if cities or towns take certain steps related to energy efficiency and fossil fuel reduction, they're eligible for state grants to do this, that, and the other. Her bill is if cities and towns take certain steps, and one of them, I believe, was having someone on staff who's got green stormwater infrastructure certification. Every time we do a new road, a new sidewalk, a new something building, someone should be looking at, oh, is there an opportunity to do this there? Oh, well, we know from our new H&H study that flooding is really going to be a problem there. So let's blah, 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 blah. So I think something like that really pushes cities and towns. And we know that money works. We know that money motivates cities and towns to act, because the Green Communities Act has been quite successful. Something like that, I think, would be helpful.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Raina.
Hi, everybody. Emily, I see a roadshow in your future.
I'm not running again. I need time to
No,
talk about this stuff,
You
right?
just have to get the word out. And I think this is a great, you did a great presentation, and I think would be uber beneficial, to get it out there in the speaking sphere. But I wanted to just let you know, and I'm going to send this content to you, because I tried back in 2014 and I sent it to none other than Ruth Ann Fuller and David Kalis. I was at the Boston Architectural College, and I saw a grad student's presentation of a sunken water garden project for Countryside, of all places, Countryside. And it was super cool, because what it was a series of, big, huge ponds on site that served for roof runoff that would get pre-treated through the planters. And then it's saying that it would actually had, specifically formulated soil medium capture for the first flood contaminants. So it really was working with the site and trying to, make it a win-win, so that then, the kids they'd be like an outdoor museum. They would actually even have an appreciation of, active ecosystem on site. And it was there to resolve, the site's mediating in terms of the water issues on the site. So I just think that there's a lot out there. It needs to be, as you're suggesting, the right hand talking to the left hand, and just getting people aware, but also information in some sort of database, so that then, if a site like this is being considered, people can pull up this content. And this was done like almost 10 years ago.
Right.
It was in 20, and people know about it within the city, but has it been applied? And so it's that kind of thing where there has to be a political will.
Right. You need that sense of urgency.
Right.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Amy? You're on mute.
You're muted.
Yeah, I should learn by now, right? Thank you, Emily, for a great overview of how Newton should be preparing to mitigate impacts from higher temperatures and extreme precipitation events by adopting nature-based solutions. This was one of the most fascinating talks. Emily, I miss you. This is great. I can't wait to hear more from you. This was so enjoyable. So, folks, if you enjoyed this conversation, please keep an eye out for more in the series in the future. Thank you everyone for coming this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again at future climate crisis discussion panels. Thank you, Gary Rosinski, for organizing these series of panels and finding fascinating and fabulous speakers like Emily. So keep going. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Good night.
Right.